Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I have a very awesome guest on my channel today, Tali Botz. I first discovered Tali through the Naval Gaze podcast with Terrell, and it is an amazing podcast. Highly recommend you check that out. And it's Navel, so that's kind of like the pun, like naval gaze, but gaze is like Gays, so it's like gaze, not like gazing, but so it's kind of
There's
like a
layer
pun.
of puns.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like really nice. So that's my first question. So what is the Naval Gaze podcast, and why did you and Aaron decide to talk about this, and how would you describe like the central theme of the podcast, and also just
Yeah.
introduce yourself generally?
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I am Tali, big fan of Ray, so it's awesome to be here having this conversation. I'm 30 years old. I'm from New York, married to a woman with dysphoria. So that's kind of the general outline of my life and what brought me into this space. The Naval Gaze, we call it a podcast about autosexuality. Our primary focus that kind of brought Aaron and I together in hypothesizing and talking before we decided to do or have our conversations publicly was this idea of formerly known as pseudo bisexuality, or what people today are calling metasexuality, which is basically homosexual behaviors in autoheterosexuals, in autogynephilic males or in autoandrophilic females, talking about how to kind of make that distinction. Like, how do you know if this is, meta allosexuality or quote unquote true authentic homosexuality? And so that's where the gaze part comes into the name. So we're navel gazing, like you said. We're kind of talking about ourselves and kind of over interested in trying to figure ourselves, our lovers, our friends out. So it's definitely a navel gazing exhibition, but the gaze comes in from the fact that Aaron and I are both females in same-sex relationships that are a little more complicated when it comes down to gender expression and gender roles and motivations for transition. So Aaron is a trans man who has come to understand the motivation for his transition to be autoandrophilia. And we came to also understand, and by we, I mean my wife and I, and then also sort of Aaron and I, came to understand my wife's experience of gender dysphoria as probably autoandrophilia. And so on our little podcast, we talk a lot about autogynephilia because that's obviously where we can pull the most actual research, right? Where we can look at, where we're doing less theorizing and more actual sort of study. And also, I think for me, it's definitely, it's funny, I've come to really like resent the word activist, but what I'm doing is partially activism. Like, I feel like it's important to destigmatize autogynephilia to the extent that people can understand themselves in it, understand their motivation for making really extreme body modifications and life changes. So that's part of my motivation for sure, is trying to like get the word out there and bring both sides of this culture war to a more reality-based understanding of what is going on with transmania.
Yeah, I definitely relate to being navel gazing about one's own sexuality
Yeah.
and life experiences. Definitely relate to that, and also I relate to that. The sort of there is a genuine desire just to like understand the world, but I feel like this knowledge is like would be really helpful, and also like this knowledge would like kind of kind of cleave through the Gordian knot of like a lot of these intractable, debates. We kind of keep circling around over and over and over about, safeguarding and badly behaving AGPs and female spaces and protecting female spaces from the bad AGPs and all this stuff. So, and then preventing trans widows. That's like a big thing of mine. I'm always talking about how do we prevent more trans widows from being created, and like the universal consensus in the AGP community is like self-awareness seems to be the starting stone. But I really want to dive into your particular experiences because I think they are very fascinating. So if you would enlighten us, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about your own experiences with experiencing autosexuality in your life.
Yeah, right before we started recording, you mentioned that you watched episode 1 of the Naval Gaze, which is really where I do the most personal navel gazing. And I made a joke that I always kind of hope people will skip over that episode because that was probably the most like self-divulgent that I have been so far. It's interesting. I'll get there. I'm just going to meander for a minute. It's interesting. It's interesting, like what pulls people into these conversations and what draws people to other types of people. Ostensibly, I got into this conversation because I was formerly like just a lefty radical activist. So I was like a TRA in my own right. And then my wife, who was, for all intents and purposes, like a butch lesbian, like came out to me not as trans, but as like experiencing lifelong gender dysphoria, sex dysphoria. And so I kind of went from like affirming is actually not strong enough of a word. I was encouraging her at that point because I, as a trans activist, as a lefty, I believed the only moral thing to do is to help that person live their authentic life, whoever it is. They come to you and tell you that this is their truth. You need to help them, live that out and manifest that. And so I was very much her cheerleader in the beginning of this. And then I got piqued somewhere along the way, and my wife ended up desisting. But so that's like, and then I got very interested in what is causing all of this gender distress and what's going on, what's going wrong with all of this. But I also like undeniably am drawn socially, at least. It doesn't feel sexual. I'm sure some people have speculated or whatever. I don't know. But like socially, I feel really drawn to a lot of autogynephiles, a lot of, what we could have said like queer people, and kind of for my whole life. Like my mom always remarks that I like had a real fascination with drag queens as a child. Like it's funny. She says that like when the first time I saw a drag queen, I like stopped her. We were in Provincetown on family vacation, and I like stopped her and was like, "Oh my God, mommy, she's so beautiful." And so I was just kind of like enamored by it. It was very PG. It wasn't, my parents weren't exposing us to anything super inappropriate.
I like find that interesting because a lot of people describe the aesthetics of drag queens to be grotesque. So it's interesting that like a child like sort of like drawn to that, almost like a hyper stimulus. It sort of like it pops out against the background of everything else as being like it's just alluring and it's sort of like grotesqueness. So it's kind of interesting how what can be grotesque to some can be like deeply fascinating to others. And I experienced that myself in regards to like always being interested in like androgyny and gender bending. That was actually one of the first memories I ever have in terms of one of my triggers. There was this like old like cartoon called Possible Possum, and there's like this little cartoon character of like this owl who in order to pull off some scheme, he dressed up as a lady blue jay. And I was just so intrigued by this little like gender bending thing in like this cartoon. It was so innocuous, just like it's like, or like Bugs Bunny dressing up. It's like all these, I was always like those are like core memories in my mind is these like
Mm-hmm.
young exposures to like gender bending and stuff. So there's something going on there. I think so. Yeah.
There's something going on there. Yeah. And right. And like people, it can be uncomfortable to talk about because people don't want to sexualize children. And I don't think it was a sexual experience for me. And it sounds like it wasn't necessarily a sexual experience for you either. But yeah, there's something going on there. And what you just said, I've heard from a lot of autogynephiles before, is this fascination with gender bendy things, even in the forms of cartoon and like really non-sexually charged content, but also any type of transformation being from a really young age really fascinating. Like even if it was like animals morphing in some way, like you said, I guess with like Bugs Bunny, although I guess those were like anthropomorphic.
Yeah.
So
I was obsessed with Animorphs. Do you remember
that's
Animorphs?
interesting. There you go. Yeah, there you go. So there's some all of this has just made me feel like there is like sort of something related to kind of like an autistic brain that people that people are kind of latch on to some of these things, in particular from a really young age, without trauma, without exposure to excessive pornography that people like to point to.
Right. Like I have so many people, so many GCs on both Twitter and in my YouTube comments seem convinced that the first trigger for autogynephilic feelings is like necessarily pornography. Like it's like they just can't imagine any other type of stimulus. And that may be true for some people. Like that was like maybe their first exposure to like that. Like
it's definitely true for some people.
Like gender bending, but like
right.
It's like if you go back, particularly like in the 90s and 80s and stuff, like the like gender bending and cross dressing was like pulled off for laughs and gags. I remember another big one for me was Ace Ventura, Pet Detective 2. Like that scene at the end where sort of like that reveal of like it turns out like that was like a male at the whole that like blew my mind. I was like I like could not like stop thinking about that. But yeah, obviously that was like not pornography, but it's still like it triggers.
I mean, White Chicks was like the biggest movie of my generation, and that's these two men more beyond cross-dressing. Obviously they're also doing a little transracial thing there too, which is funny in the way that it we would analyze it through that lens today.
And one thing is interesting to think about is so there are like lots of young boys and men who are exposed to that same stimulus. There's probably like like if you have 100 boys, they're all and they all watch Bugs Bunny cross-dress. It's only like a small percentage of them that seem super fascinated by it and like sort of get obsessed about it, and like it becomes like it's like a sexual imprinting on like the brain. It becomes like this core thing, whereas like most men, it seems like it never really develops into like a neurosis or a fixation mentally. It's just sort of like they're not affected by it. And to me, that's indicative that there has to be that underlying predisposing factor that acts as basically like a supersaturated solution that the trigger catalyzes that reaction, and then it creates like a phase changer. So that's kind of like the metaphor I use, as sort of like that like catalyst triggering phase change type metaphorical language to describe the process of causation. Because the key point is that there's a super saturated solution that's just like waiting there. It's just waiting for the stimulus, and then once it gets the stimulus, it just like radically completely changes, and kind of like unlocks that like latent potential, because it's about the potential within the person. And I feel like that's what you and Aaron are sort of doing, is like theorizing the mechanism of what is that underlying disposition and how it works. And it seems like, to my mind, you guys have identified that core underlying mechanism as autosexuality. Like it's a self-referential process of some kind that can get distorted or manipulated in a variety of ways and express itself in a variety of like context.
Yeah, totally. So like you said, that's what Aaron and I believe. So I'm very inclined to agree with what you just said. And I think the same thing is true. Like, I think what you said, that only a small portion of the boys who are watching this Bugs Bunny thing, right, are making more meaning of it, right, as it's sort of imprinting in their brain and then developing into, sexual connotation, not Bugs Bunny specifically, but, the transformation or the feminization. I think the same goes, I was just having a conversation on Twitter Spaces last night. I think the same thing goes for like the sissy hypno porn. Like, yes, I think sissy hypno porn is playing not a significant role in terms of numbers, I don't think, honestly. Like, proportion of trans identified people, I don't think a large proportion of them transition and their first exposure with sissy hypno porn, but it's obviously playing a role. But I think that it's not like any man who is exposed to this is going to be hypnotized and then want to become a woman. It's autogynephiles and agamps, right? It's males with this predisposition who are going to watch that and feel really compelled by it and feel compelled to watch it again and to keep searching. Do I think it's possible there would be people who would continue watching out of a sort of morbid fascination? Sure, yes. But I don't think it's likely to it's not going to induce trans identity in any man who watches it. And that seems obvious to me. But like you're saying, there are a lot of gender criticals in particular who really want to believe that that's what happens. That essentially, because they need, it goes back to how they victimize the young and villainize the old, because they have to believe that all of these men just start out as vulnerable good boys who just one time, right, were exposed to the wrong thing and it led them down this path, that there was nothing internal.
Right. Well, it fits into the general radical feminist anti-pornography position, which, there's a lot of legitimate criticisms of like the pornography industry from like a ethical perspective, and I'm like, on board with that. But there seems to be this sort of like political idealism as far as like, well, if we get rid of the pornography in society, then somehow we can solve the autogynephilia problem. It's like, I think that's a little naive. I don't think, I think it is possibly exacerbating the phenomenon, and also I think it's interestingly, the sissy hypno stuff is plugged into the gender identity ideology, because if you some of the most popular stuff in that genre is explicitly gender identity ideological. So that's like, I am a woman, not just like I'm a sissy, but like I am a woman. So they're playing off the identity of a woman and using like transition, like actual like W path transition as like they're basically fetishizing W path transition, fetishizing gender identity ideology, and fetishizing the identity of like like a woman. It's like, oh yes, you were valid as like a woman or whatever. And it's like, so they're supposed to, and it's like, imagine if like a young autistic boy, like black and white thinking, lack of social awareness, like prone to sort of like I think the like black and white thinking is sort of like the core phenomenon there. And yeah, I just think there's this kind of like a gullibility that's like, I think it's easy to fall for that, and that becomes like a driving force. But going back to the thing in regards to, there's only so many boys that have the underlying disposition that will cause them to be enthralled by this type of transformation content. And on the flip side, in the females, what percentage do you think have this sort of autosexuality? Because if you look at some of the most common debunkings you see from the trans activists about autogynephilia, they always point to the Moser study. That was like a survey of like 25 natal females in like a hospital setting, and they gave them some scale, and and they always say like 93% of all women are also autogynephilic. So autogynephilia is love of oneself, like being aroused by looking at yourself and seeing like, oh, I'm sexy, I'm womanly, I'm feminine, and being aroused by that thought. They say, oh, that's just normal female sexuality. So since you're a female and you sort of relate to this autosexuality to some degree or another, could you sort of like give your take on like whether this is quote unquote normal female sexuality?
So Yeah, it's going to be a slightly complicated answer, as all of my answers tend to be, but it's inherently not normal female sexuality, because what makes autogynephilia like a salient experience, you know, for the people who have it, is that they are a male, right? That they are not what they would love themselves as, right? Or would be attracted to themselves as. I think, yeah, the Moser studies had really severe limitations, sample size being one of them. It's like, it's a little funny the way that a lot of us talk about statistics, right? 93% of all women, and it's like you had 25 women in the study, even if you had 2,000 women in the study, right? And just the fact that all these women came from the same like career. I mean, there's just a lot of limitations in the sample that was studied, and I think there's limitations in the wording of the question. So no, I don't think autogynephilia is standard female sexuality, and I think that I have, the way that I kind of describe it is like, I feel like autosexuality is a big part of my sexuality, not the only part of my sexuality. I guess I'll just like go into it. I guess where I'm hesitating for a second is because even so, what I'm about to describe as my own sexuality, I have no idea really. Maybe this is common female sexuality. From what I gather talking to other women, it's not. It's not common, but I don't know how uncommon it is or how common it is. So I couldn't really give you numbers. I could give you a better hypothesis of like what I think the breakdown of currently trans-identified people or females is. But with regards to autogynephilia in females, if that is to exist, I think that word, it should probably have a different word. I don't know that it's the exact same thing, but I'll just talk about myself now. I've always felt like aroused by my body, I guess, like for lack of better terms. And I'm going to keep like waffling here because a lot of people will say, well, that's normal, right? Like you people want to feel sexy. And, you know, the same way that people will say it's normal for like a trans woman to have sexual fantasies of herself as a woman. It's like, well, obviously you have sexual fantasies and you are a woman in your soul and your mind. And so that gets you aroused. But just from like a pretty early age, I was into taking pictures of my own body, which is a very AGP male thing to do. We could just start there. Okay.
Yes, I can relate to that.
Yeah. And I was like young, but I was okay. So I need to set the stage. I was precocious, like intellectually and physically. So I developed pretty early. So when I was pretty young, I was on the internet. This is like in like the AOL chat room era. That's when I grew up. And so I was like meeting. I was ostensibly straight, as in I was flirting with boys in school. I wanted male attention mostly in school. But I was very into exchanging. So incriminating. I was just like into exchanging naked pictures with women online, basically. Adult women who very, very likely didn't know how old I was. Were they women? I look back now and ask myself, I don't know. Who knows who I was talking to? Who knows who I was sending this stuff to? I was very young. And we were all kind of new to the internet to a certain extent. But that's what I thought I was doing. And I liked looking at women's bodies in a way that felt very related to my body. Like I was most intrigued by women's bodies that I felt like looked like my own. And I was also really into like taking the pictures of myself. Like I got a lot out of staging the pictures, taking the pictures, looking through them. I remember like a young experience too of like masturbating to content of myself that I had made, basically. So that's kind of like one factor that makes me think like there was something kind of autosexual happening there. And then with regards to my allosexuality, so I like dated guys in high school. That's who I hooked up with and dated. But I also like would kiss a girl any opportunity I got. I remember being younger, a lot of the girls would all kiss each other, and so that was just like easy for me. I would just I could just be one of the girls who kissed the girls. But I also had a few experiences of like kissing girls in private in high school, you know, like where no one else was watching and we didn't talk about it after. But I never conceptualized myself as gay. Had my first, I guess, like real like crush on a woman in college, and that was kind of the beginning of my experimentation. But my sexual arousal has like always felt really kind of dependent on me. So it's like if I look good, I'm aroused, basically, or like I want to, that's what I would want to have sex. I don't remember ever really experiencing like a partner or someone else like being like, oh my God, that person looks so good that now I would be in the mood or something. Yeah, it feels like very much like if I put myself together and look good, like then I that like that gets me in the mood type of thing. I also, in terms of like fantasizing, I don't think I'm a very creative fantasizer, whatever that means. I most of my fantasizing is kind of replaying things, or at least kind of recreating things that I've already done, I guess, sort of in my mind. But they seem almost like the way that metasexual or pseudo-bisexual fantasies are described, where like I remember talking to Aaron about this once, and I made a comment about like I can't really see the other person from the waist up. And Aaron's like, so it's the faceless man. Like these are the fantasies that you're having, because the fantasies are me. It's like I'll be seeing like myself from behind, you know, like straddling someone, and the other person is not really important at all, really, in the fantasy. I walk this all back to say, I don't know how common this is. Like it could be, especially if female sexuality is much more relational as opposed to like, you know, target oriented, let's say, then maybe it's normal for female sexuality to be self-referential, I guess, in that way.
Well, just because it's relational doesn't imply it's self-referential, because in that relational context, it's like the woman doesn't experience the spontaneous arousal. It's only it's more like, it's called responsive desire. That's how I describe it. So it's like they get ready for sex when someone is pursuing them. So that's sort of like the key thing, and that's what like activates it. But it doesn't mean like once they get that arousal like activated, that like that arousal is like because they're aroused by like themselves.
Good
And
point.
and as far as like how common this is, maybe a distinction could be helpful here, because I'm sure a lot of like if like any trans woman who's a tier A or who sort of hates Blanchard and autogynephilia theory is listening to this, I'm sure like, see, like females can experience this too. This is perfectly normal. And I would like to make a distinction between having an autogynephilic experience versus having this be your primary sexual driver, the thing that you return to over and over and over, and constitutes the primary thought process while you are having your best, like most pleasurable sexual experiences. Because I think, you know, that might be helpful in terms of like, yeah, just like sort of sorting out, because you'll often hear trans women who are TRAs who are sort of trying to debunk autogynephilia. Say like, oh, it's so common for a woman to look in a mirror and think like, oh yeah, I'm hot, and maybe feel some like arousal at that. But or women are these days, they're very into makeup and selfies and Instagram and all this stuff, and that seems sort of similar. They're sort of like into makeup and selfies and filters and Snapchat filters and AI filters and Instagram and all this. So it seems very like kind of auto. But I would say like in the bedroom, a lot of, particularly in my sense, like the most prototypical stereotypical heterosexual woman, they're going to, I don't think they're going to experience like the focus on themselves as being the key aspect. I think
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know. I'm just speculating because I'm not a female. I'm just like
Right.
having like, talked to different women. Like I know there are some women like their big thing is like making the guy come. Like that's like their focus. Like
Right.
they want to please the man, or they're into his body or something, or they're just focusing on the pleasure, because you can be self-referential insofar as you're focused on your own self. But what is it about yourself that you are focusing on? You're focusing on the sensations within yourself. So you're getting penetrated and that feels good. That's generating sensations. You're now experiencing the sensations. Is that autosexual because you're experiencing your own sensations? No,
Right.
that's just called sensation.
Right.
um and like that might be the level. And also I think for a lot of women, particularly women in like normal hetero dead bedrooms, like they're not experiencing any pleasure. It's like a chore. And in that sense, like they may not have a strong sexual drive at all. Their drive is
Mhm.
more to secure providers and
Right.
to provide security and like and then as far as like what their maximal sexual arousal, it's like you know 50 shades of gray or something. It's not autosexual. So in that sense, like
Mhm.
I think there's probably like a wide variety of different things that different people focus on
Right.
while they're having sex. But I think this thing, and I think what you described as far as like getting a lot of pleasure out of like for example like self photography, I've always noticed that this is like a key thing that autogynephiles
It
engage
really does seem like a key
it's
thing.
yeah, it's so classic. And and I also in my own life like I also enjoy taking not safe for work
It's like the
photos.
self-objectification.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And
Which makes sense if you're autosexual. If part of your sexual arousal has to do with yourself, you're going to objectify yourself sexually and enjoy that.
right, right. And I was thinking the other day like and I made a post about this on like Twitter about some females that might be um displaying autogynephilic experiences, like the like, women who go through this bimbofication process. And it really does seem like the goal is to turn yourself into a sexual object. It's a self objectification. This is like the dollification, where you sort of become like this like sex doll, and the sex doll by definition is an object. It's sort of
Mhm.
like it's designed to be treated purely as a sexual being, rather than like a full person
Mhm.
or sort of like temporarily bracket out the more like human elements and focus on being an object of sexual desire, which I think like plays into a lot of like the meta attraction fantasies. And also in the sissy world, it's incredibly common during a sort of binging cycle for for the autogynephile to sort of like get all dolled up in their sissy outfits or the makeup, whatever. Take a bunch of pictures. Open up like a Reddit account, post them on Reddit, and then they like will masturbate, orgasm, and then like delete everything, and like so, and then they just like continue that like cycle over and over and over. But like people don't realize like how big the sissy side of Reddit is. Like there
Hmm.
are, if you sort of like go onto Reddit and you enable not safe for work and you sort of browse through the not safe for work sissy subreddits, and you add up sort of like the combined um, subscription account of like of the subreddits, it's bigger than the safer work trans side.
That's
It's like
crazy.
millions and millions of people are subscribed to these not safe for work sissy subreddits.
Are
The
those subreddits, are they trans? Are they also are they woke? Basically, I guess is my question.
It's like
Are they
orthogonal
captured?
to wokeness. It's like pre wokeness. It's just yeah. It's yeah. They're like not woke. It's entirely like
Okay.
the pre ideological awakening. But if you sort of look into the, but there's some sissy subreddits that are like more discussion based and sort of search in there for like the trans related topics. You also then you can start finding that like sissy to trans pipeline.
Right.
And that's where you start to see the retconning. You start to see the shame. People know that, hey, this isn't going to make for an inspiring story on my, BBC interview or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
so then you start downplaying that. You start diminishing it. You start buying into the ideological language of like born this way,
I
brain
think they do
sex.
buy
Like,
into it. Yeah. I think
yeah,
it's much less intentional retconning. And it is like, yeah, then suddenly they've conceptualized their sissy phase as internalized transphobia, right? Like,
right.
yeah.
Right, because now they sort of dip their toes into the safe for work woke trans spaces, and they say like, is it invalidating for me if like I thought it's a fetish, and then they all share the same 3 articles that sort of say that all kink is just a coping mechanism for these deeper identity issues, and then they all cite Julia Serrano's subconscious sex theory that says that this is all being driven by the unconscious mismatch of the subconscious sex. The brain thinks it should be female and the body's male, so there's a mismatch, and that drives the kink. But because like kink is supposedly the only
Well,
socially
she's right.
acceptable,
She's right, except it's autogynephilia that's making the brain expect to see a female where it sees a male. So
right,
close.
right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm like curious how you would respond to this like or like how would you steelman the case that these trans activists are making that um, autogynephilia is a normal experience among women? It's like just
Oh,
so
well.
see if you can like sort of like, or it's just like not even possible.
What I can try, but it's going to be hard because it's not. I think what I could steal man is like sort of going back to my role of like destigmatization is like it's just okay.
Right.
Like and again I just think like the to
Well, what
steel man
about
that position, you have to take for granted, you have to accept the premise that there is some like mental sex, right? That you can have like a brain sex that's different because otherwise they are obviously different experiences because one of them is experienced by a male, right? And so
right,
if a woman is turned on by her femininity and a man is turned on by the femininity that he doesn't naturally have, those are fundamentally different experiences. They're only the same insofar as, yes, females can also find the female body on themselves erotic. That's kind of the best steelman
right,
I can give because there is and again, and maybe I'm the example of that.
right,
And that's something that I want to elaborate on too. Is like it does feel very much for me. This is where I think the word autogynephilia partially fits, even though I still think it's not a great way to describe the females. But it's very much like my self-referential arousal is very much about my womanliness.
right.
Um,
Well, one thought is like a lot of women. I think it's typical to be for your normal woman to be more on the submissive side sexually, and I'm wondering if your thoughts on this idea that to some extent self objectification is like part and parcel what it means to be submissive. Like that's sort of like
mm,
baked into the structure of that like dynamic, as far as you have like the dominant one and you have the submissive one. And it's sort of like the dominant one is sort of like this concept of like the man ravaging the woman, sort of like, you know, that concept of like ravaging necessarily implies a form of objectification. And like a lot of women are into that. So like, does that seem similar or analogous, or is that just like, is it the same thing, or is it just like analogous? Because I feel like there's a lot of stuff that's self-referential, but it's like, it feels like, oh, it's self-referential, therefore it's autogynephilic, but it's like, or it's like auto heterosexual or whatever, or like autosexual, but like it's like the mode in which it's self-referential, because there's many ways to refer to yourself, and it's like, and it has a particular sexual valence, and it's not just has that sexual valence, but like that sexual valence is like primary for the fantasy life, primary for the psychological centrality of that notion to one's life and the things that you spend your time thinking about in your spare time. Where I feel like the autogynephile becomes obsessive about this stuff, whereas the woman who looks in the mirror and finds herself, oh damn, I look really good today, before she goes off to work, but she's not sitting there at work like thinking about that all the time. She's probably like engaged in, you know, relational social dynamics of like, you know, typical human experience, whereas the autogynephile is like, you get wrapped up in it, because there's such a strong contrast between the male body and like the desired object of wanting to, and also you're just constantly looking at these pretty women and all around you, and you're like just jealous all the time. They like gender iffy.
And just like a higher sex drive on average too could contribute to that difference in like how much time they're spending thinking about it. That's really interesting what you said about like the self-objectification being like sexually female coded. I think that's right. My spicy take that you just said very casually, but and maybe you don't know that people object to this so much, but women like to be objectified.
Yeah, I thought that's obvious. It's like
obvious.
It's like
get ready for the comment section. There's a lot of people who take issue with that.
Well, the people who take issue with it are clearly projecting their own dislike of being objectified, and like, and that's just like bad.
I think they're lying too, to a certain extent. Like, listen, yes, and here's the thing too that people then don't want to kind of acknowledge: women want to be objectified by people they are attracted to.
Right. They don't want to be objectified by Bob from finance. They want to be objectified by the 6'4", blue eyes, finance trust fund guy. That's who they want to be objectified by.
Right. Like this idea that like, oh, women don't want to be catcalled. They don't want to be catcalled by the fat construction worker. But like you said, if this like handsome, you know, 6'6" man in a suit walks by and is like, you know, makes some comment, they're going to be fucking flattered and hoping that, you know, he's going to say more.
Right. Well, speaking of Fabio and romance novels and things like this, I'm curious your response to the sort of Contrapoints argument in regards to debunking autogynephilia, which is like, well, autogynephilic experiences, this self-referential meta attraction is common in women because women are into these like romance novels, and like if you read 50 Shades of Grey, like it's not about you know, endless pages of descriptions of like his rippling abs and objectifying the man or being attracted to the man. It's about like how the man validates her own sense of femininity or something like this, or the fact that there's sort of like this slow burn romance, or like, and it's sort of like Contrapoints was trying to make this idea that like that's like now how she sort of thinks now, post transition, post HRT, with her like libido newt, and she's sort of making this like sort of like this like analogy with like romance novels as being like female typical. But like I think like what you were talking about with like wanting to be objectified by that 6'4" guy who's like such a, you know, like a one in a million thing, but it's like, you know, maybe you had sex with that guy like once in college, and now you're just like obsessed with that. You'll never get over that, like that one guy that like rocked your world, you know, 20 years ago, and like, and that's like your peak thing, and everything else is just like a pale imitation, and you're like maximal arousal is like in that sort of situations, but you just don't run into those guys that often because those guys aren't the ones who are settling down with like the stay-at-home mom or whatever. They're like
Right.
the chads of the world who are, you know, the cads, the cads and chads.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think, okay, there's a few things that you said that I wanted to respond to. I found Contrapoints is a really interesting figure. I like her, or at least I liked her. I feel like her content in the last year or so has really just been like overtly political, lefty, queer kind of garbage.
I agree.
But like,
Totally.
but her videos were good, and she was quite thoughtful and quite like, she kind of walked the line of like not giving into the PC police. I don't know. She kind of did a lot of PC bullshit too, but she was like, I think she was given a lot of grace to kind of both sides things, right? In a way that she's not even willing to do anymore, it seems like. But yeah, I don't know. I think like the most compelling part of that video is like where she kind of steel man's AGP and like points out how she fits every single like every single aspect of it. Like that was way more compelling than the debunking to me. If you had another question in there,
it was just like
again.
the Contrapoints arguments about the romance novels
Right.
being like prototypical female sexuality. And like I did on like my video in response to that Contrapoints, I had a number of people of like women comments saying like, no, Contrapoints totally got that wrong. That like romance novel concept is like false. Like we actually are like attracted physically to masculine men, and we do find masculine men attractive. It's just like, I just think it's more rare because like there's like not a lot of guys who are like super hot, you know what I'm saying? Like and like for example in like my own case, like I am attracted to like men, but like but not all of them. It's like very rare
Right.
for me to see a guy I'm like, wow, that's like an attractive man. It's like most guys are just like, that's an average dude, whatever. And like average dudes don't do anything for me. So it's like
That's kind of how I feel about men at this point.
It's like 1 out of 100 men. I'm like, oh wow, that is truly an attractive man that I can just like stare at and like admire the beauty of his body. Whereas like women, it's like your average woman to me is like attractive because that's
right.
like my primary gynephilic attraction. But and I almost wonder if like because we know like you know, there's all this data from the dating websites like OkCupid and Tinder where like 80% 100% of women rate 80% of men as not attractive.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the vast majority of men on those sites are not considered attractive by the vast majority of like women. So it's only a few men, a small percentage of men who sort of reach the threshold for attractiveness that's necessary for the vast majority of women to say like, yes, that is an attractive man that I will swipe right on in order to have like a casual sexual encounter with. Like otherwise, they're not ever going to have a casual sexual encounter with those average men, but they're going to compromise in order to secure, you know, like a provider, a caretaker, a husband, a father.
I think it's more complicated than that. I think well, there's a rich irony in that, right? It's like the women who complain about dating app culture, right? Where it's like you're just putting up these pictures and they're judging only based on your looks, you know, and it's like, and yet it's men who are getting the short end of the stick there. When we're only judging on a few pictures and on people's looks. I'm not like anti-dating app. I met my wife on a dating app. There's obvious utility for it in our modern society, but I think getting off the apps, a lot of these men would have more of a chance with women because women's arousal and emotional, physical is going to have a lot to do with more than just the looks, basically. And so I think like the same goes for women. Like I think like a really confident woman who's not a 10 could probably, you know, snag a really attractive guy, let's say. But I think there's like a lot of other factors that could play and that could hurt or help the case, right? Like women have a really strong ick factor. So even if you were like pretty good looking, but then you meet in person and you've got like this weird like spit thing, you know, or whatever, you know, like that's gonna ruin it, you know. If you, so I think it's more complicated. I'm sympathetic to the fact, and I think it's correct that like just that women are basically like what's the word for it, for like the science of like women just kind of like science of seeking like out of their
hypergamy.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, so
I think that's the real thing for sure.
I think it's totally real, right? But I also do think people have there's a lot more wiggle room, and a lot of these guys would have a chance like actually, you know, in person with them. But you're right too. The response from the woman might be different. It's not like, oh, go home. I want to go home so you can ravage me. It might be more of, yeah, like I could see this person as a provider. I could see this person.
Yeah, I mean, when I speak like that, like I want people to be clear. Like I'm using those things as like abstractions to like make a generalizable point at an abstract level in regards to these like general like broader dynamics. But like when you zoom into the individual personal level, obviously things are more complicated and like nuanced at the personal level. They're just sort of like general abstract patterns that can be like abstracted when you like look at like in a broad array of like situations. So they're just sort of like shortcuts to refer to concepts like hypergamy, refer to these things, which, you know, like I definitely think there's like validity to them, and it's been well studied in like the evolutionary literature. Going back to autogynephilia, I'm kind of curious, like, do you think that, so it seems to be like a, you know, so Julie Serrano like more or less admitted that she's an autogynephilia. She just redescribed it using female embodiment fantasies. And you see this constantly where, you know, people will on one side of the mouth, they'll say like autogynephilia is debunked, pseudoscientific. On the other side of the mouth, they'll say like they'll literally describe the phenomenon. Because at one level, autogynephilia, it's not explanatory, it's phenomenological. It's like just describing the psychology of the experience without necessarily positing like the underlying mechanism. Now, researchers in sexology have posited these mechanisms like the erotic target, you know, errors and stuff like this, these like location errors. And like you and Aaron are speaking theoretically about, you know, this autosexual mechanism, and Phil Illey talks about like the inversion of orientation and all this stuff. We're all talking about these like possible mechanisms, but that's sort of like theory, and then there's like the phenomenology, the like description of the experience. And it seems like many trans women are on board with the phenomenology side of things, particularly describing like the trajectory. That's like, well, it started off like in the exploration realm of the stuff, but like that's not core to who I am. And I think ultimately at the end of the day, because as we saw in like in Alice Drager's book, even Andrea James at one point admitted in writing that she related to the autogynephilic experience. It's just, but it's the political ramifications of the theory that drive all the noise around it. So I'm wondering if you think that the political fighting around gender criticality is just like has poisoned the well with this term so much that we will never get
it back.
get it back.
That's a good question. Maybe. I hope not. I was just recently thinking about something along those lines, which is just like AGP never had a fighting chance. It's still a relatively new concept. I mean, 1989 in the scope of history is very, very recent. And when it could have come into prominence, it faced its, pushback campaign and smear campaign. And like all of that happened at a point where like it still hadn't spread, like I was talking with Maya last night on a Twitter space, and she was talking about Zucker's research. And Zucker grouped the homosexuals and the bisexuals together. And it's like Zucker and Blanchard were like literally close to each other, like in proximity, in physical proximity too. And it's like, and it didn't get everywhere, even within the field. So yeah, like that's always kind of working against us, is like it was never to a large group of people, maybe to the majority of people, it never existed firmly as like an accepted concept kind of ever. So I think they've used and abused the word autogynephilia. Some of them, I think, really don't understand it. Others seem to understand it. So I get really frustrated by the way that they talk about it.
So one thing that the like standard tier A talking point is that gender identity is different from sexuality. They say like, so your sexual orientation has nothing to do with your gender identity. These are like orthogonal concepts. They kind of like, And one of the things that supports this premise is you often hear trans women say things like, I've never been aroused by crush kissing. I've never done this. I've never done this. I've never had this fetishistic thing. I've never, had a euphoria boner. I think we're sort of zooming in on the more like the asexual and alloerotic cohort, basically the trans women who have like already have low sex drives, and they may like really dislike typical masturbation of like with like the penis and stuff, and they'll sort of do like all these kind of like creative masturbatory acts, like lying on a pillow or like rubbing, sort of trying to just use like a finger
trick
rather
their
than
brain.
it's sort of like they're trying to masturbate in a purportedly more feminine way to the extent that's possible with like a penis, but they're not doing like the typical like male thing. And so it seems like for these AGPs, like or for these young male dysphorics, like there seems to be like a repulsion to sexuality, a disgust of sexuality, thinking sex
male
is,
sexuality.
Like, thinking it's gross. And then once they transition, like they may have like very low libido, very very rarely get like aroused, to the point that it starts causing like actual like problems, because like when you don't use it, it gets atrophied, which leads to pelvic floor issues, which leads to urinary incontinence, something like I've dealt with myself, which is incredibly embarrassing, incredibly annoying. It's one of like my least favorite like side effects of the hormones, is like the atrophy of my pelvic floor, which caused urinary incontinence. And so like these that's like one of the big narratives driving the rejection of autogynephilia, is like this cohort. And then I think everyone else like appropriates that experience of like, oh yeah, I like relate to that. It's not sexual, even though they're kind of like retconning and like forgetting all their like transformation porn they watched growing up. So yeah, I'm curious like how you and Aaron are conceptualizing autosexuality in the context of this more like asexual cohort.
So, well, first I have a question for you, if you don't mind, if it's not too personal. Is it safe to assume then that for a certain period of time during your transition or when you were living, as a woman, whatever that means, that you were not using your genitals, basically?
It was a lot less frequent. Like my sex life was, like I just was not that horny. I was
Mm.
just like, yeah, and also, yeah,
Was not being horny distressing, or you liked that, affirming in some way?
um, it was affirming to some sense because I was dating women, and it's sort of like it sort of this is not a word. I'm like making up this word. It like depredatorized me such that
Mhm. That makes
made me not a threat to women because like I'm not this like horn dog who's like interested in having sex with women all the time. So,
Mhm.
and I think this is actually like a huge, um, or one of the big reasons why autogynephiles like the effects of hormones because
Yes.
the relief of the compulsive sexuality to they sort of so there's sort of this idea that like every experience felt by the autogynephile is connected to arousal, but for a lot of autogynephiles who particularly like are have a lot of internal misandries such that they're like deeply ashamed of being men. They like hate men. They like bought all this like feminism crap about how masculinity is toxic and how they just sort of like
I think it's the
are
autoandrophobia. And I think people who are autoandrophobic might be drawn to the type of some of that feminism stuff. I agree,
right,
like it comes out
right.
very misandric, but
Yeah.
or
Well,
misandrist.
what I was gonna say is like the thought of basically like taking hormones and like never getting an erection again is like very appealing, which sort of
Yeah.
cuts against this narrative that a lot of GCs have of autogynephiles is that
100%.
they just like love their penises and they just like want to walk around graping everyone or like they just want
Yeah.
to shove their dicks in people's faces or whatever. And it's like for a lot of autogynephiles who don't necessarily go on to always get surgery, but they just like it is actually the atrophy of the penetrating organ or the inability to get hard is actually deeply appealing because
Hmm.
it makes them no longer a threat to women, and they like that.
I think this is really interesting, and I'm glad that we went down this rabbit hole because you're right. The gender criticals make that broad statement about AGPs, and it's almost funny, right? Because it's just like, again, you just don't even understand what you're looking at, obviously, because there are many reasons, like you just said, that AGP males are not walking around wanting to grape everybody, right? Not only because of the sort of emotionally and psychologically not resenting male sexuality and being happy to be rid of those urges and whatever, but also like for anyone with like anatomic dysphoria, they don't want to be able to use that's not the sex they want to engage in. And I think we talked about this when you came on Naval Gaze. Is like a big part of it for you is like not wanting the expectation of the male sex role when you're
Right,
in a intimate relationship. And so again, these women, because it's mostly women, but it's men too, they don't understand autogynephilia at all when they think that the prototypical autogynephile is walking around with an erect penis that he wants to use at all times. It's a
right,
fundamental misunderstanding of the condition.
right.
Um, but what else was I going to say there? But also I think there's a lot of AGPs who assume that AGAMPs are they AG. There are some AGPs who talk about AGAMPs the way that GCs talk about AGPs. It's like, well, the AGAMPs, right? They don't. Their psychology is not to become a woman, but rather a feminized male, and so they're okay with their penis. Is like a big, I think, misunderstanding, and part of this comes from there obviously are some AGAMs in the same way that there are AGPs for whatever reason who are comfortable, that top and stuff like that, for lack of better terms. But I think there's this idea that someone whose highest sexual goal would be to be a feminized male would then not have that autoandrophobic psychology of seeing male sexuality as gross and potentially damaging.
Right. Yeah,
And
I
I
mean,
was
I can like absolutely relate to that because I would consider myself like of the AGAMP type of,
yeah.
and I, so I never really wanted to get rid of it, but at the same time, I definitely contemplated it, but that was driven by pragmatics. So, for example,
Mhm.
I wanted to go to like a yoga class and like wear yoga pants, like that's like because I have transvestic AGP, like I'm interested in women's clothing. Well, one of my favorite pieces of clothing is like tight, form-fitting yoga pants. Like, but the thought of having someone like see me as like presenting in a feminine way and like like and in detecting my bulge in any way was like it was like nightmarish like thought in terms of like
Mhm.
embarrassment. So like, but so yeah, in that sense, like I had autoandrophobia about my penis in those particular contexts, but in the bedroom, in regards to like that, going back to the self portraiture aspect,
Yeah.
in that sense, I liked that combination, and I'm
Right.
attracted to that combination on like
Right.
other males as well. That's actually like one of like my favorite combinations of body parts is breast and penis. I really like that. So,
Yeah.
and I like that on myself. And that was like a huge trigger for, or one of these like autogynephilic triggers was exposure to female pornography when
Mhm.
I was like younger. That developed like yeah, like a lifelong sexual like imprinting. But yeah, I think people think like, oh, like if you like it in a sexual context, then you also like it in every other context. But it's like,
Mhm.
um, or it's like, and, yeah, and like going back to like the role, it's like just because you are okay with your penis existing doesn't mean you're okay with your penis existing in a stereotypically masculine male manner. Because the sort of stereotypically masculine male penis is the giant rock hard penis. That is the archetype.
Mhm.
Whereas like a lot of agams are super into chastity kink.
Right.
Um, and the chastity kink necessarily prevents erections. And it's sort of like for a lot of people who are into that, they perceive that as a way to sort of they perceive it as a way to make the penis more feminine, because it's sort of like it's smaller, it's restricted, it's like so yeah, that's like a huge thing, and also
Mhm.
it's sort of like fundamentally emasculating in some sense, to sort of like to remove that male potential for erection, which is like so critical to like the archetype of what we consider to be like the sexual male being
Mhm.
who's like prototypically masculine. So yeah, there's like a lot of, so like is like hating your erect penis but loving your penis in chastity, is that autoandrophobia? I mean, this is sort of like semantics in some sense.
It's really interesting, and that makes sense. That's one of the distinctions, sort of, with AGAMP and AGP, right? Because if you are attracted to, like you're saying, the combination, and that's what you've inverted into yourself or whatever, um, right? That you would be more comfortable with the presence of it, I think, but that you would have the same discomfort, yeah, with the male role. And I think this is something that I just thought about recently. I'd be curious your thoughts. Again, in the kind of like spaces that I'm in and the people that I talk to, there's been like a lot of hammering down lately on this distinction between AGP and AGAMP. And I think there are interesting, meaningful distinctions in the definitionally, right? Of like what is your highest arousal, right, target, and then, right, what do you want to present and manifest. um but I there's this, again, I feel like some of these AGPs want to sort of believe like, well, they don't want to be real women, right? They want to be trans women. And so it's almost a view of AGAP as like being necessarily less severe, or like not committing to the bit to a certain extent. But what I was thinking about was like, okay, but if an agam wants to be a trans woman and trans women are women, then why would an agam is also going to seek access to the female spaces because trans women have access to the female spaces. And so it's being maybe carried along to a certain extent.
Well, I relate just my own personal experiences with, you know, the sort of like identifying as a woman versus a trans woman, and sort of like, and the sort of like split you see in the community. I just saw this YouTube video. I can't remember her name. It was like it's like 5 harsh lessons I like learned about transition after 9 years or so. It was one of those things. And like the last one was like, she was like, basically like yeah, I'm okay with like trans women or trans women. And I think the trans women who are okay with that statement, trans women are trans women, and they sort of like are okay distinctly identifying as trans feminine. Like, so for these sort of gender identity ideologies that, you know, trans woman, it's 2 separate words. Trans is an adjective, woman is the noun. They primarily identify as the noun, the woman, and the trans is just a modifier. Whereas the agams, I think, are more likely to join them together, and their primary identity is not as woman, but trans woman. And they have no problems removing the space between the adjective and the noun and sticking it together to make a new noun that the noun is trans woman or trans feminine. And that's how I identify it. And partly it was motivated by my own philosophical realization that trying to defend trans women are women just leads to philosophical dead end. It's like impossible to defend that thesis without leading to incoherence of some kind or another, or contradiction. So it was partly driven by like my philosophical musings, but there's also like a sense in which that's coming from like my own comfort in like identifying as trans as being like my primary, like my gender was trans. It always used to piss me off where like I would be forced to like pick like what my gender was like man, woman, non-binary. It's like, where's trans feminine? Like that's my gender. My gender is not woman. My gender is trans feminine or whatever. And I think the trans women who are comfortable with that way of thinking, it like tracks the like AGAMP, AGP distinction.
I think that makes so. Do you think that I would think that's probably true, with the exception of people who are self-aware about this distinction? So like I think there are plenty of self-aware AGPs who are like, I'm a trans woman, you know, I'm not a woman. And like you were very much, oh, I'm a trans woman, not a woman, before you were, I guess, self-aware as an AGAMP.
Well, it's funny because even back in my TRA days, the final chapter of my book, my TRA book, I talked about autogynephilia. And my criticism of autogynephilia was I did not know what AGAMP was. I didn't know there was already a term for AGAMP. But basically in the book, I coined a new word called like autotransgynephilia, like love of oneself as a trans woman.
Wow.
And
AGAMP.
I didn't even, AGAMP. And I didn't even know that was a thing. I was like, well, yeah, the problem with the Blanchard typology is it's just not accurate enough. Like, because like my goal is not to approximate like a female, it's to approximate this like female body or whatever. So I was self-aware of like what my actual desires were.
Right.
I just didn't buy into like the framing of Blanchardism because I thought it was like too reductive or whatever to say that. And in some sense, I don't disagree with what I said, because my problem was I mistakenly thought I bought into the framing of like it's just a fetish. I was like, well, it may start off like that, but that's not accounting for how it elaborates and develops over time, and it can't be reduced. And like you can't say that that's like the only motivation, because every single human being has like a variety of complex motivations for all behavior, just because like, you know, all decisions, particularly ones that are so complicated and like important as like transition, like necessarily involve like a wide variety of different motivations. It's not so that was like my problem. Is more like I saw it as like too reductive, whereas like now I have a different perspective, which is that um, it's just a model, and the model is like helpful because it abstracts out all the stuff that's individual to people's lives, and it like looks at like the core mechanism underlying the various pathways. Like, what is the unifying thing? Because I think I want to step back and why are people like you, me, Aaron, Phil so fascinated by this? I think it's because
Mm-hmm.
we're sort of like we're systemizers and theorizers who are interested in like the etiology, and so like we are trying to posit a universal explanation to
Mm-hmm.
account for all this stuff. Because I see constantly like why are you trying so hard to fit everyone into this square peg? Like, why are you trying
Yes.
to do this? Like, well, I do that because parsimony is a scientific virtue. The simplicity in your model is a scientific virtue. So if you can
Mm-hmm.
have a simple theory
Mm-hmm.
that explains the maximum amount of data, that is a sign that you're onto something.
Yeah.
Um, that you're tracking truth when the simpler model explains something better than the more complex model.
Yeah, I completely agree. I remember Aaron and I talking about this in these exact terms early on in the podcast. Right. It's like maybe we wouldn't be so into the theory if it wasn't so damn good. Right. It's like it is. Yeah, it's the parsimonious explanation, because otherwise you need to have these like 12 different moving parts to try to explain this thing. And yet if you eliminate all of those, right, or control for all of those things, the autogynephilia is there, and it has incredible predictive value. Not so, predictive is maybe somewhat the wrong word, or like predictive, not so far as in the future, although it does have predictive value, I think, in that way too. But just like in what we were doing earlier, where like I could guess parts of your story based on knowing other autogynephiles, right? It's like,
Right.
oh, this transformation, I've heard this before. Oh, this picture taking thing, I've heard this
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah. And
sorry
like,
that it that it works.
right. And the work that like Phil Illy and like Kevin Sue are doing with like extrapolating these erotic target things to like other paraphilias, like beyond like the particular transgender case, like
Mm-hmm.
the like, you know, you're attracted to amputees, but you want to be an amputee. You're attracted
It's very
to
compelling to me.
like, you know, yeah, like there's just all this stuff. It like sort of there's like a pattern. And also, you know, if there was like a new fetish that developed, let's say like, you know, something that'd be brand new, like a fetish for wanting to be like a large language model or something. like obviously that paraphilia didn't exist 30 years ago, because you know,
Right.
but you would predict that if there is a community of people who are writing erotic stories about being attracted to artificial intelligences, you might make a prediction that there's someone who wants to be, or they have a fantasy about being a computer themselves. They're attracted to
Mm-hmm.
computers and they want to be a computer. So you
Mm-hmm.
can sort of make that prediction that you're going
Mm-hmm.
to see this envy desire pattern show up over and over and over and over and over in all these different cases. And to me, the universality of that pattern is indicative that there must be some underlying mechanism that is shared across all these diverse experiences of paraphilias, in which case, and it makes sense because we don't see this variety of sexuality in the animal kingdom, like because
Right.
um and well what is it about humans that makes us such freaking kinky freaks? You know, like um it's probably our self-consciousness, which is one of the most distinctive aspects of human cognition, is that it's incredibly self-referential.
Mm-hmm.
We have reflective self-conscious. We can have meta states about it. So we can have higher order thoughts, thoughts about thoughts, thoughts about those thoughts, thoughts about those thoughts, endlessly into an infinite recursion and regression. So this ability to reflect on our own mental states is like, there's a lot of cognitive scientists who think that that reflective subconsciousness is like a uniquely human thing. So it's not surprising that disorders of self-referential cognitive processing in the sexual domain are widespread in the human world, and this is like accounts for like the wide variety of paraphilias we like see relate to this general pattern. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Phil's book is really effective. I was very compelled by when he lays it out, right, and compares it to these other paraphilias or sexual attractions that get inverted. That's very compelling, right? Where it's following the same structure, where they are attracted to this thing and then also want to embody this thing.
But again, we
And
see it's not all of them. So not all people into
right,
amputees
no,
want to be amputees. And so that's what we see in the gynephilias. Like not all gynephiles want to be gynephilic themselves, and
the
not all.
majority don't.
Yeah.
Ostensibly, the overwhelming majority, especially if we're just talking about gynephiles, right? Because
Right.
that's most men.
Right.
But yeah, and I think it's interesting too. Like a lot of people say that like all GAMPs are AGP, and it's like, well, is that true? Because again, like these other things, like you were just saying, there are the people with the attraction to it that doesn't have the autosexual component. That's just their highest arousal stimulus, basically. So, which I think is just kind of interesting to think about in the realm of AGP, because there are all these things that are connected, but we don't entirely know how they're all connected, right? And like, yeah, like are GAMPs inherently autogynephilic in some way, or for some of them just typical guy? From what I can tell, some of these guys seem to just be typical guys, and I think the only thing that makes the Blanchardians go, "Ooh, AGP," is because they're attracted to trans women.
Right. Yeah, and there are like if you talk to trans women who regularly have sex with like self-identified straight men, there are some of those straight men who are super into the penis and they want to like experience giving oral on like a trans woman. They want to be taught, for example. But there are some of these straight men. They they ignore the penis. They sort of yeah, so it's like in that case, it's like it doesn't seem very AGP-esque to me because it's
Right.
not that like obsession. So yeah, I definitely think there are like pure GAMP cases, but I couldn't tell you like what's like the relative percentage. I do think it may be a minority, but on the other hand, a GAMP comes in a spectrum of intensity, and if
Right.
you're on the mild end, yeah, you might have that like autosexual component to your attraction to trans women, but it's not so compelling that it's going to drive you to ruminate about that or like speculate about transition.
Well, what
Though,
I've heard people say is that it almost can, like, being with a trans woman can kind of satiate that desire.
yeah, but
It's
on the
almost
flip
like,
side, being with the trans woman can sometimes just make you jealous. You're just
right.
like, wow, it looks like she's having way more fun in bed than I am. And then it's like, ooh, I want to experience that kind of fun too. So, yeah. Um,
There's something you said earlier that I wanted to kind of go back to, of this idea of like being objectified, being kind of like the inherently female or a component of female sexuality, at least. And I think this is true. And so just a little more kind of self-disclosure, like all of these things, like yeah, like if my kind of autosexuality is the related to femininity, right, and all of that, yeah, that feels like very central to my sexuality, is like I want to be like worshipped almost, right? Like it's very appealing. I want a partner, a sexual partner who is like really obsessed with my body, right? And like my womanliness. And then again, a lot of people will say, well, that's just normal. Like everyone wants their partner to be attracted to them. And like, true. And also, so maybe that is normal. But again, it's like very, very much about me. And even like when you were saying like 1 in 100 guys, you're like, oh, wow, that's like an attractive guy. it's kind of how I feel with my attraction to men. Like most do absolutely nothing for me, and then every once in a while there's a guy that's just so attractive, and it's like, wow, like that's a yeah, and it's arousing, right? And so there I lose my lesbian card there. But when I have that experience, it's very much like, it's like the next thought is like his arms like around like my little feminine body. Like it's like it goes immediately to like how feminine and womanly I would be in a sexual encounter, like with that person or something like that.
Right. That makes sense because like you see the big arms on the guy, the big muscles, and it's like, oh, what can you do with those muscles? It can pick you up and do the ravaging.
Right.
Like, well, you see the
Right.
little weak scrawny guy. The little weak scrawny guy cannot do a good of a job ravaging you. That's like the
Right.
big muscly guy. So it's like, yeah, I think that attraction to that is part and parcel of like how that plays out in like the bedroom and also I think normal heterosexuality is about polarity. You're attracted to the opposite. So it's like you
Mm-hmm.
know, you want sort of the contrast. It's like it's the long hair versus the short hair. It's the smooth body versus the hairy chest. It's
Mm-hmm.
the smooth skin versus the rough skin. It's the smooth face versus the beard. There's this polarity with males and females, and I think
Mm-hmm.
normal heterosexuality thrives on that polarity, and they're attracted to that polarity. And when that assumption of polarity is violated, when you start seeing the guy with the fingernail or the nail polish, that's when
Mm-hmm.
the ick factor comes in, because the ick
Mm-hmm.
factor is a mechanism to detect men who aren't sufficiently polarity, who don't have the strong enough polarity. And why are women attracted to masculine men? Because high testosterone. Why are women attracted to high testosterone? Because in order to have high testosterone, you have to have a good immune system, because high testosterone levels are actually bad for your body. So
Interesting.
in order to survive a high testosterone, you need a strong immune system in order to not have that testosterone ruin you, essentially. So only very healthy people can handle high testosterone and still be healthy. So that's like an evolutionary signal of like fitness. So that I think and so in terms of like whether this like gynephilic autosexuality is like normal female sexuality, it just doesn't
Right.
make sense evolutionarily that would be the case. It seems more likely that this is like a side effect of like a mechanism gone awry to some extent, which I'm starting to increasingly think of like AGP as like a normal mechanism that's broken. And a lot of people think like, oh, you're talking about sexuality and using words like broken or whatever. It's like, you know, and it's like, oh, it's like not everything has to be healthy. Healthy normal sexuality is like, what do we even mean by healthy sexuality? Like the only way in which health makes sense as a philosophical concept is in the concept of like the evolutionary environment of like optimality. Otherwise, you
Mm-hmm.
can't extract normality out of like the human body except by reference to what was normal in the evolutionary environment. In which case, autosexuality doesn't make sense except as a mistake, like a something's gone wrong in normal development. That's sort of how I think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're I agree. I've heard a few people, I'm not going to be able to give any examples right now, but a few people hypothesize just like the evolutionary utility, I guess, of AGP, and like
I don't buy it. I do not buy it.
that's fair. That's fair.
Because AGP drives like in like prehistory and like in like not prehistory but ancient history. There's accounts of males who voluntarily castrate themselves. That's probably different for autoandrophobia from AGP. That is clearly not good for your fitness
Right. No,
evolutionarily.
no, yeah, totally. Right, but then it's like, but then why are yet here we are in 2024 and there's still AGPs, so they are reproducing. Um,
Well, it could be that the mechanisms for heterosexuality are fragile because the human bodies are you familiar with the term kludge?
Mm-mm.
Kluge. So let me just Google this to get the definition. A kludge is a workaround or makeshift solution that is clumsy, inelegant, inefficient, difficult to extend, and hard to maintain. The term is used in diverse fields like computer science, aerospace engineering, evolutionary neuroscience. It's basically like a Rube Goldberg machine. So a lot of evolutionary mechanisms are like kludge-like insofar as they're just like they're not built efficiently. And so in order for the body to have the genetic plan to encode building out the complexities of human heterosexuality to be successful in like this complex social competitive world, that end state of like a to develop those mechanisms of heterosexuality built out of all the spare parts of the brain which have been like assembled across evolutionary time out of like spare parts like that developmental process is fragile. So it's like so yeah, like there could just be like a predictable way in which like the environment like breaks that fragile development, and that could just persist in the population over time, without it being weeded out of the gene pool, just because there's so much inefficiency like baked into the human body already. Um, so it's sort of that should be like my hypothesis.
Okay, so somewhat related also to this idea of like the self-objectification being a component of female sexuality. Aaron and I have kind of sloppily hypothesized the correlation between autogynephilia and masochism. There seems just anecdotally, since obviously we know so much less about autoandrophilia, but anecdotally there seems to be some correlation between people that Aaron and I would describe as autoandrophilic, because a lot of them are not self-identifying this way, and sadism. And I've kind of conceptualized, and this is just like offensive to some people, but I've kind of conceptualized like masochism as like the exaggerated form of female sexuality, and sort of sadism as the exaggerated form of male sexuality, or like psychosexuality, which kind of tracks with what we were talking about, like with the ravaging, right? The ravaging man. And so, okay, so I'll put that there. And then but what we still have been trying to figure out is like, well, we don't believe that autogynephiles like have a female brain. So it's not that this is like necessarily inherent, but I guess like how conscious is it? Like how much is it? Like where is this desire coming from? Is it just the fact that paraphilias cluster, and so like luck of the draw, there's a lot of masochism and a lot of autogynephilia? Or is it kind of more sexed in that, or gendered rather, in that way that I've kind of conceptualized it? And I'm pulling this out of my ass. But yeah, that it seems to be like sexual masochism seems like an exaggerated form of female sexuality. And again, I know that's like offensive to relate masochism and female sexuality. But
yeah, so I think you're onto something, and I had to Google this real quick, but there's sort of I'm not sure if you're aware between of like the term MEF. Have you ever heard that?
What does it stand for?
Masochistic emasculation fantasy, or masochistic emasculation fetishism. There's actually a self-aware subreddit that is a sister subreddit of Ask AGP.
Okay.
People are hypothesizing that there's sort of like two dimensions, or this is another one of the like the joints within the autogynephilic cohort in terms of like because there's some autogynephiles for whom the core of their autogynephilic experience is that of humiliation. And that humiliation comes
That's
from
so
that
problematic for people to hear.
yeah. Well, people think that I think a lot of GCs think like, oh, like you think it's like bad to be a woman, therefore you're humiliated to look like a woman, therefore you hate women. It's like, no,
Right.
these men love women, they worship women,
Right. They think it's great to be a woman, and what the embarrassing part is that they are a man trying to be a woman. Right. Like,
right,
yeah,
because often who is the one in their fantasies that is emasculating them and humiliating them? It's the
a
mistress,
woman.
the
Yeah.
dominatrix, the goddess that they worship. So
Yeah.
they women are on the pedestal for these men, but they consider it like that's like the key phenomenological experience is that of humiliation. And but not all AGPs. I think that's one of the one of the worst uh, GC misunderstandings is this. They like see some AGPs have this humiliation kink, and they therefore extrapolate. Well, this must be true for all AGPs. It's like no, actually that's just one of the cohorts,
Right.
and the other cohorts like it's much more about the the finding oneself deeply sexy when one is feminized. Not that you're humiliated. It's that like
Right.
you think you're the sexiest you've ever been when you're feeling feminine. So you don't find it humiliating. You find it deeply sexy. That's why you want to take pictures of yourself. Whereas the humiliation side is often coupled to fantasies of like getting caught, being caught by your neighbor, being caught by your
Mm.
roommate, and all this stuff. It's like, oh, I'm like caught, and therefore I'm being like, and it's like the force feminizing stuff, and it's like, so yeah, I don't know. I thought that's interesting because it definitely ties into masochism because the
Mm-hmm.
humiliation is masochistic.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm not sure how to connect that to what you were talking about earlier.
No, that is really interesting, and that reminds me of I spent a lot of time a couple of months ago watching. I highly recommend it. You could probably do actually a lot of cool videos on this. There's a bunch of like old late '80s, early mid '90s talk show episodes on YouTube, and so I was watching a lot of like old Donahue shows, uh, Ricky Lake, things like that, and they've got a bunch of like pretty incredible cross-dresser episodes and transsexual episodes and ABDL
That
episodes.
was one of the triggers when I was younger because I was homeschooled.
Wow.
So I sat around watching a lot of daytime talk shows when I was younger, and
Hmm.
I remember these transsexuals coming on Jerry Springer
Yeah.
and on like Ricky Lake,
Hmm.
Maury
Yeah.
Povich, like
I love Maury.
like, all this. This is like one of these like these like classic core memories for autogynephiles
Yeah.
who grew up in like the 80s and 90s like I did. So
Yeah, totally. But so I remember what you were just saying. Uh, there was this one guy. I think his name was Ginger. Or that was the name that he went with on the show. He was probably the person on the panel that would have given the most people the cringe and like ick, but I just like thought he was awesome, which again, it's like what makes you drawn to these people? I don't know. But he was a transvestite, like obviously AGP to me in my estimation. And he was an ABDL. He was an adult baby diaper lover. And he said that he got into both of those things kind of via humiliation kink, but they both persisted. And it's not inherently about the humiliation for them anymore. And I'm inclined to believe that for a couple of reasons. It's like why be honest about it ever being a humiliation kink? Like it's like you would just keep that to yourself if that's not the image you want to portray. And also I believe it in the same way that I believe autogynephiles about the sexual saliency of or the erotic saliency of cross-dressing. Like I believe that you are not, losing your mind right now, or whatever, if you've got makeup on. Like, I don't think Phil in his blue dress is walking around aroused all day long. So I believe those things. So I do believe that it can kind of shift. And a lot of these people in these episodes, again, back in the 80s and 90s, they are talking about it as a source of comfort and soothing. And like, there was this female ABDL who was like really fascinating because for all intents, she was this like attractive young woman, young professional woman who like went home and dressed up as an adult baby. And she said for her very much it was like a soothing thing, that she found comfort, in not in physically dressing up, but then also the sort of like age regression that you do, right? The kind of mental shift, the getting into your feminine persona, right? Or getting into your kind of like baby mindset. And so I believe these people that like it changes the, like the psychological function, I guess, or how it's serving you, how, what it means to you. I do think that kind of evolves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of paraphilias, just because I have so many like GCs and like my audience, I want to definitely make sure we talk about safeguarding, and I want to talk about this going back to this idea of paraphilias clustering, because one of the things we see from the GCs is like one of the main reasons they want to keep the autogynephiles out of the female spaces, besides just like the intrinsic philosophical self-determination to like make like a female space female only, like just like that, but like in regards to like more like practical things in regards to safeguarding, and like they point to this idea that paraphilias cluster, and then they point to things like these little factoids about how like a higher percentage of normal serial killers or psychopaths or transvestites or and then they point to like these sexual offense rates of like trans women, or the like a higher percentage of trans women who are in prison are there. I mean, I think I actually dug into those statistics. I question them to some extent, but there does seem to be a sense in which if you're going to be a trans woman and you're going to get in trouble with the law, it's probably due to some sexual crime or something. So like, but so yeah, like, have you and Aaron theorized at all like why? And even if this is like a small, very, very, very small minority within like the AGP population, there does seem to be an elevated risk factor, or not mean, or at least a correlation. I don't know what the explanation is, but like a correlation with these other socially maladaptive traits like psychopathy, sociopathy, and this sort of like classical paraphilic disorders that like necessarily involve like the violation, like boundary violations, like voyeurism, exhibitionism. I think it's called like frauderism, stuff like this. So like to me, that's also stemming from the same underlying autosexuality disposition mechanism we're talking about, because we're trying to do like it's almost like a universal theory of like paraphilias, but it's like why yeah, I don't know, it's like I think this is one of the key reasons why there's not as many self-aware AGPs, because people don't want to put themselves anywhere in the same box as like
no, you're totally right. Even just the most classic one that I resent, that we have to like, that we can't just like speak openly on YouTube, but the PDF files. Yeah, no one wants to. You're right. That comes into every conversation about this. And I think it is like,
I mean, just look at like all the accusations about Chris Tyson and Ella Hollywood and like all these people, there's this is like every other week it seems like there's like some new trans women getting busted for like PDF file type stuff.
And people don't, so people don't want to be, they don't want their pure trans identity to be associated with something like that.
Because justifiably, it provides a very good argument for keeping all trans women out of female spaces, which sort of is in violation of the political project of the self-ID movement.
Right.
Anyway, sorry, I just wanted to interject that.
No, yeah. I think, so I don't quite have any theories about this, about kind of like what is the mechanism here and like why are you, I think it's interesting that the paraphilia thing makes a little more sense, but then like you said, why are we also, does there seem to be a heightened correlation as compared to the regular, the normal population of like personality disorders, right? Psychopathy. That's pretty interesting. I don't know. It seems obvious. I think
I wonder if it's like related to like to the intelligence thing because of the correlation that's well known between
mm,
like AGPs and high intelligence, and also psychopathy is associated with like high IQ as well. So like maybe that's like the mechanism, or there's some third thing causing both high intelligence and the like paraphilic psychopathy or something. Like I don't know, just like spitballing here.
yeah, no, that's actually really interesting. Something that I would want to, that I'd be interested to just, yeah, to mull over more, right? Or is there some third thing that if you have that, then it's more likely to bring out the two, right? Like the AGP and the psychopathy or something. Yeah, so that's interesting. With regard to the paraphilia conversation and just like the, I do get a little like black pilled of just like sometimes I feel like this is all just like hopeless, like trying to make any sense of this and trying to make a difference here. And
I think you should not. I mean, I think yeah, be pessimistic, but I see progress happening all the time.
I do too.
Like I just saw Phil Illy being interviewed on some big Christian YouTuber Preston Sprinkle, who's this big theology guy who does like you know, it's like yeah, this autogynephilia thing is like leaking into mainstream. Also, I'm seeing more and more trans content creators who are not that they're not like full blown like anti woke like Blair White or whatever, but they're not full blown tier A's. They're kind of like
I
in the
agree.
middle, and they're sort of like, and most of them are more on the HSTS side. I see more and more HSTS trans influencers talking about this, and you know, of course, we have our own theories about like whether they're truly HSTS, and
I was gonna
some
say
said it doesn't
interesting.
it doesn't really matter for all intents and purposes, but um,
It doesn't matter as long as you're not trying to claim that your purported HSTS status makes you somehow more valid or, you know,
right,
or
the
more
like gray, like
true
the true
trans.
trans, or you know,
Right.
Brianna Wu's like bullshit that she's always on about.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Yeah. I'm at my wit's end again with Brianna Wu. I feel like I've gone through a lot of emotions with her and my parasocial relationship with her because obviously she has no idea who I am or anything like that. Um, but yeah, I mean, you've got the people who are trying to kind of rebrand AGP as a sexuality, which I think makes sense. Like, I think it's not just a rebranding effort, but I think it actually is just helpful in understanding the phenomenon and like I think it's a more useful framework for understanding how pervasive in a person's psychology this is.
Well, actually, I liked. I asked James Cantor the other day about what's the difference between sexuality and sexual orientation, because he said AGP is not a sexual orientation, but it's a sexuality. He said sexual orientation is about like who you are attracted to, but then he defined sexuality as basically just, he said in the research field, it's used as a catch-all to describe just one's general sense of eroticism. Like just your sexuality is just like all the things that are erotic to you, or like your erotic life is yours, and that to me that tracks as far as like
That tracks too, actually,
about
especially. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Just in the way that I've conceptualized my own autosexuality is that I've said it feels like a big component of my sexuality. It would feel silly for me to call it my sexual orientation because it doesn't feel true. I'm not an alloerotic, you know, in that way. And I have like, yeah, I've always had interest in partnered sex and partnered relationships and things like this. But yeah, no, that makes sense to me as a concept. And I've actually been using that. It's interesting that he said that specifically because I've been trying to use that. I feel like I've been getting to arguments with like gender critical gay men who are really averse to autogynephilia being conceptualized as sexual orientation. And I've been saying that like, okay, but it's sexuality. Fine. It's not a dear precious orientation like your true authentic homosexuality.
yeah,
But it's sexuality.
the like argument they'll make about the orientation is like, well, orientation is like legally protected characteristics, so it's already in the law. It's already written in the law that sexual orientation is a protected thing. So it's like they're worried that once you start normalizing the concept of this thing being called an orientation.
Well, you shouldn't be able to discriminate against someone on the basis of their autogynephilia. You should Fine, that's fine. You're
Well,
right. You're right, and that is what they say.
they just immediately jump to the slippery slope of the PDF files. Oh, that's like a slippery slope to saying that PDF file is like
Yeah,
a protected, because the same arguments
but
that
so is gay marriage. Like, sorry, the PDF files, they were already trying to slip that in with gay liberation. It's this is what Phil always says. It's like is and ought. Like, we can acknowledge what is happening, manifesting organically in nature, without approving of it. Again, I feel like it's a
right,
naturalistic fallacy. If we
right.
acknowledge that pedophilia, I really hate these euphemisms
I
really
know.
so much.
It's so stupid. I actually
It's
probably YouTube doesn't even really care, but we all do it.
I don't think they do, but I'll do it for the protection of your channel.
Yeah, thank you.
But but yeah, like saying that this exists and that it's has a strong hereditary component is not the same thing as saying yes, you should be allowed to do that. You know, like
Right.
we can still make law in the same way that, like, and this is maybe not something that everyone wants to hear, but like autogynephilia can be morally neutral, can be protected even as a sexual orientation, let's say, without ever allowing males into female spaces. One does not necessitate the other.
Right. Yeah, and one of the tweets that James Cantor has consistently gotten like flack for, and like sort of labeled him as like a PDF file apologist to some extent, is like he had this one tweet where he said like, if we're going on scientific principles in terms of like how we determine what something is a sexual orientation, and if the LGBTQIA plus is simply a cataloging of all existing sexual orientations, then if we're being philosophically consistent, scientifically consistent, then he thinks that the P ought to be included because the mechanisms, descriptively speaking, purely descriptive, not applying any moral judgment, then it would be in there as because the way it functions as far as like how that attraction works in the brain is the same. It's analogous mechanistically to how attraction works in all these other and all the rest of the alphabet. But the fact that it's not in there is indicative of the fact that the LGBTQA plus blah 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 is not actually a scientific description of all sexualities. It's actually a political category for the sexualities that we normatively approve of by society. Like that's the key thing that the people don't realize.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I am sympathetic though to slippery slope arguments because the entire history of the proliferation of gender ideology, we've been tumbling down a slippery slope in many dimensions. So it's like, I get it. I totally get it. Like why there's that fear, because we consistently see, for example, you know, we've seen a number of vetoes in California in regards to attempts to shore up protections against like child sex trafficking or something, and the LGBT community seems to be like, well, this is going to be used against us or some way. So, I mean, it's sort of, they kind of are their own worst enemies to some extent.
Totally.
And but yeah, like I feel like most people like aren't.
Well, that's like there have been like multiple videos of like pride events where they're literally walking around jokingly, and they are joking, but they will literally chant, "We're here, we're queer, we're coming for your children."
Right.
Like, what the fuck is wrong with you? If you don't want that association made, I hear you, and I agree with you that a lot of what the proliferation of trans and gender ideology has been somewhat of a slippery slope. But it was a slippery slope with good intentions, like in a way that I just like don't see us getting to this, like, yeah, I don't know. Like, I think it's just like harder to get to, like, yes, it would be okay for a 40-year-old to have sex with a 5-year-old. Like, that's like, that's a really steep slope. I don't know. Like that's a drop actually.
Right.
But
Yeah.
you're right. And I yeah, I don't know. I guess it's hard also because I just have to like I'm constantly reminded that I don't see things the way that a lot of other people do. And I've realized also like really recently, like I have a pretty high disgust threshold. And I think a lot of this stuff just comes down to disgust. And I'm obviously disgusted by, the act of pedophilic, sorry,
That's
of yeah, right, of any of those actions, but I can talk about them dispassionately.
right.
Like it
Yeah.
doesn't give me I don't have a visceral reaction to talking about these classifications, right? And the way that the brain works and arousal patterns and stuff like that. Whereas
Do you think you have to be kind of like a kinky person to be able to have this sort of conversation? It seems that to me that's like the common connection between like
interesting.
the people who are interested in sexuality as like a phenomenon, like it just objectively just like are often, it's like a coping mechanism for their own kinkiness because it's like
That's really
they
interesting.
um,
I don't know, because like on the one hand, I'm not super kinky. Like I was like kind of adjacent to like a kink community for a little while. But
I
I'm
just
definitely
mean
like,
like, yeah, I don't know.
no,
Yeah.
I'm definitely sexuality has been a big component in my life from a young age, frankly, from my sexual awakening and like puberty. Basically, it's been a big driving force in my life. um so yeah, maybe that's really interesting.
Yeah. I was going to
And I
say
think
something. I was going to
yeah,
say something about like the gender criticals and this debate. Yeah, I don't know. I like, can't remember where I was going with that, but I think it's just like, whether, you know, yeah, I think some people are just like, I don't know. I think there's always going to be a this like criticism or this safeguarding concern because for some people that's like all they care about. They don't have this theoretical, dispassionate interest. They're only interested in protecting the children. And to that
I
extent,
guess
sort of like, and yeah,
that
I don't know.
doesn't feel like posturing to you at all from some of them.
Oh, it definitely does. It's
Okay.
virtue. I think there's a lot of posturing and virtue signaling and
Yeah.
purityism. Oh, the thing I was gonna say in regards to why some people feel these really strong disgust reactions and they're like
Mm.
incapable of having these sorts of like objective conversations about this stuff in like a dispassionate way. It reminds me of Jonathan Haidt's model for conservatism. I can't remember what he calls it, but it's like,
Mm.
there's sort of like these innate personality differences in regards to like these values of like, do you value like sanctity, or do you value like purity, or do you value like oh gosh, I can't remember all the different ones. Oh, the moral foundations theory. So there's all these like axes like care, harm, fairness, cheating, loyalty, betrayal,
Mm.
authority, subversion, sanctity, degradation. Is that um like avoiding contamination triggers like waste products, disease, taboo, like disgust. So like um there's all these like and that he like uses that to predict like whether someone falls on the conservative political compass versus like a more libertarian or liberal or whatever. Depending on your sort of like moral like wiring or like how you're kind of hardwired. So it's things like your sensitivity to disgust as an
Mhm.
innate characteristic can actually downstream influence your being conservative about, for example, whether or not transvestites should ever dress in public or whether they should keep it in the bedroom. And people who I think have high disgust responses, like they probably want everything kept in the bedroom because they
Mhm.
are disgusted by everything. They have like very sensitive people, whereas
Mhm.
that'd be my guess.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And I always find it kind of interesting those ways of predicting people's behaviors or political affiliations, just as someone who had such a radical political change.
Yeah.
It's like
Well,
interesting to try to like map that onto my experience and also like just make sense of my experience in a way that like I radically changed so many of my beliefs, and I also very much felt a sense of coming back to myself in some fundamental ways too. Like
Yeah.
coming back to the person that I was before I was like consciously even political. I was still very I've always had a very like strong personality and a very rich like internal life.
Same. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm back to my old contrarian ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, exactly. Right. And so like I was this crazy progressive activist throughout like my college and grad school years, but as a young person I was sort of pretty contrarian. Yeah. Like I would argue with teachers, like I had issues with authority in that way. Um yeah, so I find that stuff pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And I've gotten much more politically conservative over time, but
Same.
but my disgust threshold is still very high, and I'm still very liberal in that way, and in
Yeah.
like that fundamental.
Yeah. And I think to me that's
System.
like a big predictor about whether people are comfortable with, for example, male homosexuality, is like whether they have like high disgust. Because sometimes I think people think like that they just imagine like the uh messy details of how gay sex happens. It just kind of grosses them out. And I think like
Yeah.
people who have that like disgust response, like yeah, I don't know. There's definitely some like yeah, I think Jonathan Haidt's model is like very helpful in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Tali, we're at 2 hours. This
Okay.
has been an enlightening and fascinating conversation. I am absolutely positive that my audience is going to love you.
Yeah.
And I hope that, and I'm sure they're going to love this conversation. And I'm expecting to get a lot of good comments on this. And
I already want to come back. We
Yeah.
already there's so many more things we could talk about. So
yeah,
hope to have you back.
yeah, totally. And yeah, so where can people find you, and what are you working on? Are you working on any books or anything outside of the Naval Gaze podcast?
No,
I know
I'm
you're
so
on Twitter
boring.
sometimes, but
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I just changed my handle actually, so it's at Tali Botz. I'm at Tali Botz on YouTube also if you want to bother me. But
could you spell your name, please, because so people can
Yeah.
search for it easily?
Yes, Tali Tali Botz Botz. I'm on YouTube at the Naval Gaze also. That's where Aaron and I put out usually weekly. I think we've got something like 14 episodes up there right now. We don't have one going out this week because Aaron's traveling right now, but we'll be back to that shortly. I wish I was writing a book. No, my ADHD is so bad. I'm like, I feel like I've been cursed my whole life with like being a super curious person, and I love learning, and I love debating, and I love arguing, and I love whittling, and like sharpening things. I really loved being in a research lab for that reason. Like I love picking apart stuff like that. But I've always had just a horrid time with like sitting down and reading something or sitting down and writing something.
Luckily, books are an outdated format that are going away, and
Yes.
it's being replaced by the podcasting revolution, which is actually bringing us back to our ancient evolutionary answer, because reading is a modern invention. The more like the ancient Greeks thought writing was a terrible invention, that like it's bad for everybody. Like the predominant way of argumentation and debate and like discourse and like proliferation of knowledge and teaching and like transmission of information down to the generations, it's always been oral. So I think we're now returning to our what format is actually works best for learning for most humans, which is listening to people speak. So yeah, I do not feel guilty.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think that's so true. Yeah, and that's really who I am. Like, even if I'm like texting with someone, like once what they say is interesting enough, I'm sending a voice note back. Like, I just can't type out my thoughts. I hate typing out my thoughts. I hate writing out my thoughts. Not that I'm like an incredible wordsmith when I'm speaking, but that's just how I'm just much better at communicating verbally.
I think you're a pretty good wordsmith when you're speaking. So
thank you. But yeah, no, I mean, would I love to try to do some like actual like a meaningful research kind of parallel to the sexology stuff, looking into the typology, looking in specifically to the existence of autogynephilia, yeah, I would love to. I mean, the podcast is not my job, right? Like I have I work a lot, you know, all the other excuses that everyone has, but I spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff. So if you want to catch me, you could listen to the podcast. Find me on Twitter Spaces. I'm usually arguing on Twitter Spaces, and find me hopefully more on Ray's channel here.
Yeah, totally. I'm definitely gonna invite you back. So
cool.
All right, I'm gonna end the recording and see you on the other side.